1812. A time when conquering nations was basically the main hobby of European royalty. The concept of a bad idea hadn't been invented yet, and one guy had somehow managed to take over most of the known world by the age of 42. That guy was Napoleon Bonaparte. And by 1812, this man had won so many wars, he'd basically run out of countries to beat. France, Italy, Spain, Prussia. Done. The Holy Roman Empire, he dissolved it like a group chat nobody was using anymore. At this point, Napoleon wasn't just winning wars. He was collecting countries the way people collect credit card debt. Aggressively, and without thinking about the consequences. Napoleon's hobbies included invading things, rewriting the laws of countries he just took over, and being really, really sensitive about his height. His generals worshipped him, his enemies feared him, and his ego had stopped accepting outside input sometime around 1805. It's safe to say Napoleon had what it took to run the world. So Napoleon did what any rational person would do. He looked at Russia, the biggest country on earth, with a winter so brutal it has its own reputation, and a history of destroying every single army that had ever tried to invade it, and said, yeah, let's go. Now, before we get into how this goes completely off the rails, we got to rewind a little. By 1812, the only guys Napoleon hadn't dealt with were Britain and Russia. Britain he couldn't touch. They had a navy, they had an island, and he had neither. So his plan to strangle Britain was simple. Cut off all their trade with Europe. No trade, no money, no war. He called it the Continental Blockade, which sounds like something a guy names his fantasy football team before he really thinks it through. Genius. Except for one problem. Russia's entire economy ran on trade with Britain. Grain, timber, all of it. And when Russian nobles started going broke, Tsar Alexander just quietly started ignoring the whole blockade around 1810. The way you ignore a gym membership you keep paying for, but haven't used since January. Napoleon found out. And instead of a letter, a conversation, or literally anything else a normal person would consider, Napoleon's response was to build the largest invasion force in the history of warfare. Because why have a difficult conversation when you can show up with 600,000 men and let that do the talking? 600,000 men. From France, Prussia, Austria, Poland, Italy, basically every country Napoleon had already beaten had to send soldiers to. It was the biggest group project in human history. And just like every group project, most of the people in it did not want to be there, had no idea what the plan was, and were absolutely not going to be the ones doing the work. And here's the thing. Every single person around Napoleon told him this was a terrible idea. His advisor said, don't do it. His general said, don't do it. His own foreign minister, the guy who'd helped plan basically every major campaign, resigned rather than be part of it. His brother sent him a letter that was essentially a very long, very formal version of, bro, I'm begging you. Napoleon's response, he promoted some of them and ignored the rest. His strategy, march to Moscow, crush the Russian army in one big battle, force Alexander to surrender. Clean, fast, done. His supply plan, packed for a summer trip. His winter plan, there wasn't one. Now here's the thing about Russia that Napoleon had apparently never Googled. Russia is massive, incomprehensibly massive. The distance from the Russian border to Moscow alone is over 900 kilometers, which is a long way to walk in any weather. For context, a DoorDash driver would refuse that delivery. And the Russian army, instead of showing up for the one big battle Napoleon wanted, they just kept retreating, deeper and deeper into Russia, burning everything behind them as they went. Crops, villages, food supplies, scorched, gone before the French could touch any of it. The Russian military strategy was essentially the world's first one-star Yelp review. We don't want you here, and we're taking everything with us on the way out. So here's what's actually happening. 600,000 men marching deeper into Russia in brutal summer heat. Supply lines so stretched they'd stopped working. No food because the Russians burned it. Soldiers dropping from disease and starvation before they'd even fought a real battle. And Napoleon riding at the front completely convinced this was still going to work. and Napoleon just keeps going. They finally got their big battle at Borodino in September 1812. 250,000 men. One day, 70,000 casualties. One of the bloodiest single days in the history of human warfare. And at the end of it, neither side had actually won. The Russians just retreated again. Napoleon pushed on anyway. And on September 14th, 1812, the Grande Armée finally marched into Moscow. Moscow was empty. The Russians had evacuated the entire city, and then they set it on fire. Napoleon rode into the city he'd just conquered and watched it burn for 5 days straight. He set himself up in the Kremlin and waited for Alexander to come and surrender, like a guy who wins an argument and then sits by his phone waiting for an apology text that is absolutely never coming. Alexander never came. And here's where it gets worse. Napoleon sat in a burning, empty Moscow for 5 whole weeks, sending peace letters to Alexander, getting nothing back. The most powerful military commander alive, camped in the ashes of a city he just took, fully convinced that Alexander would eventually crack. His wife's new favorite hobby was Googling how to divorce a man who just lost 500,000 soldiers chasing a peace deal with someone who left him on red. Eventually he had to leave. It was October. The Russian winter was coming, and it did not care about his reputation. The army that marched out of Moscow looked nothing like the one that had marched in. Sick, starving, demoralized. And they still had 900 kilometers to walk home. What followed was one of the most catastrophic retreats in human history. The Russian winter showed up, and it did not come to negotiate. Minus 30 degrees. Soldiers froze to death in their sleep. Horses collapsed by the thousands. The roads turned to solid ice. Cossack raiders attacked from every direction, picking off stragglers every single day. There was no food, there were no supplies, no DoorDash, no backup plan. Just men walking through a frozen wasteland trying to get home. 600,000 men had marched into Russia. Around 100,000 made it back. 500,000 men gone. Not from some epic climactic battle, from starvation, frostbite, and a country that simply refused to fight back. Russia just kept backing up, and Napoleon kept following like a golden retriever, chasing a car with no plan for what happens when he catches it. And here's the hilarious part. None of this was unpredictable, not even a little bit. Everything that happened, the scorched earth, the brutal winter, the Russian refusal to ever just surrender, had happened to invaders before Napoleon. Sweden's King Charles XII tried almost the exact same thing in 1709, same plan, same overconfidence, same result, same frozen guys walking home. Napoleon knew this. He had studied military history his entire life. He just thought it would be different for him. And that's the whole story right there, the greatest military mind in history. Beaten not by a better general or a smarter strategy, but by a Russian winter and a czar who treated his peace letters like spam email. His advisors knew it. His generals knew it. His foreign minister knew it so badly he quit, rather than watch it happen. But when you've won every single battle for 15 years, and every person around you either worships you or is too scared to tell you the truth, at some point, reality stops being something you feel the need to deal with. Fast forward 2 years, and Napoleon's empire had completely collapsed. Fast forward 3 years, and he was exiled to a tiny island in the South Atlantic, where he spent the last 6 years of his life writing his memoirs and complaining about the British. The most powerful man in the world, sitting on a rock in the middle of the ocean, telling anyone who'd listen that actually it went pretty well. And somewhere out there right now, there's a modern-day Napoleon staring at the equivalent of a Russian winter, surrounded by people too scared to say anything, completely convinced it'll be different for them.